Hi, my name is Laurie Hofmann. I am presenting on Human Trafficking 101. My master's thesis dealt directly with service availability for victims of trafficking in Utah. I looked at services that are available for victims of trafficking and services that are still needed. So let's get started. In this first slide, you will see a pair of hands in handcuffs with the words "help me" written across the hands. There are several myths to this slide. The first myth is that normally you would never see someone who is a victim of slavery handcuffed. This is a myth from the era of the time when slavery was legal in this country, when slaves were actually shackled. We do not see slaves in shackles today. The second myth is the words "help me" across the palms. It would be very difficult for someone in shackles to actually be able to write "help me" on their palms. It would also be almost impossible for them, if they are enslaved, to have that kind of message on their hands that they could hold up for anyone to see. And lastly, the hands in this photograph are white, meaning this is a Caucasian, and slavery is an international problem, and it affects all races, all creeds, all religions. And so you wouldn't necessarily see a slave who is white. So I am a fan of Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, created the Emancipation Proclamation, which led to the abolishment of slavery in the United States. And I have two quotes that are attributed to him that I think are very important. And the first one says, "Whenever I hear an argument for slavery, I feel a strong personal impulse to see it tried on him personally." And the second is, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." Slavery was abolished in America on December the 6th, 1865, and slavery is illegal worldwide. What's important about Lincoln is that Lincoln actually never lived to see slavery abolished. Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, and slavery was actually not abolished until December of 1865. So Lincoln actually never lived to see his Emancipation Proclamation put into play. In our next slide, we're going to talk about the learning objectives for this webinar. You will have a basic understanding of what human trafficking is and what it is not, and hopefully an increased awareness of trafficking victimization in Utah communities. So human trafficking is at its core a fundamental denial of basic human rights. It is rooted in exercising control and ownership over a person. Human trafficking and sexual slavery are global problems. There was a comprehensive index created by the Global Slavery Index, which completed in 2015, and we now know that there are approximately 45.8 million slaves worldwide, involving 168 countries. And there has not been a comprehensive study of this kind performed since 1860, when slavery was actually legal. Currently, there are more slaves now than at any time in human history. So slavery has existed dating back to the beginnings of civilization, which is 2000 BCE. In ancient times, slaves were acquired during war and conquest, and these slaves were used for agricultural and domestic purposes. Trafficking in Rome and Greece was extremely profitable. Emperor Claudius of Rome built a harbor called Ostia, which was specifically used for the offloading of slaves only. So no other goods were ever offloaded at Ostia other than slaves. At the height of the Atlantic slave trade in the 1600s, there were approximately 6.5 million slaves, and this was at a time when slavery was legal worldwide. And currently, in 2017, there are 7 times the number of slaves now than there were in the 1600s. And again, I want to emphasize that slavery is illegal worldwide. Another way to think of slavery: if slavery was a country, the population of slaves would fill the entire country of Sudan. If we look at the United States of America, the population of slaves would fill the state of California, from one end to the other end. So why don't we hear more about these problems? Misconceptions by the public about trafficking and victims are common. It could not possibly be happening here is something that we hear often, and another thing that we hear often is this only occurs in foreign countries. There's a basic lack of understanding as to what the terms migration, smuggling, and trafficking actually mean, and education and training is needed across all spectrums from healthcare to legislators, law enforcement, and the general public. So let's talk a little bit about what migration is. Migration has been occurring for thousands of years. Migration can be voluntary or involuntary, and migration occurs when people are searching for a better life for their families. Migration can also occur because of war, famine, or natural disasters. Smuggling. Smuggling always involves crossing an international border. You cannot be smuggled from state to state. You can be smuggled, for example, from Canada to the United States or from Canada to Mexico. Many times people pay to be smuggled. Smuggling occurs worldwide, and people allow themselves to be smuggled in search of a better life or to provide more money for their families. Smuggling is a crime against an international border, and I want you to think about trafficking as a crime against a human being. So trafficking involves a person, smuggling involves a border. Trafficking often can involve elements of other crimes such as kidnapping, physical and sexual violence, theft, and threats. And two examples from Utah would be Warren Jeffs. And I know many times we don't think of Warren Jeffs as a trafficker, but Warren Jeffs indeed is, even though he was prosecuted for other charges other than trafficking. He was actually charged with sexual assault of a minor and RICO laws. RICO laws involve the misuse and misinformation of taxes and the payment of taxes. But indeed, Warren Jeffs is a trafficker in that he used threat, force, or coercion to keep his followers in line. And the other example I give is Elizabeth Smart. And when I use Elizabeth Smart as an example, people say, oh, but she wasn't a sex slave. And indeed, no, in a classic term of what a sex slave is and what a sex slave is not, she is not a sex slave. However, she was forced to work for absolutely no pay, and in this instance, she is a slave of labor trafficking because she was forced to work in order for all of them to be able to eat on a regular basis while she was being held captive. There are 6 different types of slavery. There is agricultural slavery, there are forced marriages, which are uncommon in the United States, but they do occur. There are child soldiers, which are not seen in the United States. This typically occurs in war zones. There is labor trafficking, domestic slavery, and sexual slavery. So in the US, we typically only see 5 of the 6 types of slavery. We do not see child soldiers. Labor trafficking is in the following fields: construction, oil fields, fracking, sweatshops, and we see it also in industrial facilities. Labor trafficking is common in Utah in construction, or oil fields and fracking in the Uinta Basin. Vernal is a particular area that has been of concern. Sweatshops across the state and industrial facilities. Agricultural slavery in Utah is common on sheep farms, turkey farms, and pig farms. And in fact, one of the largest busts of a trafficking ring occurred in Delta, Utah on a pig farm. And this was an area that was studied extensively by the FBI for a period of months before they actually went in and rescued Thai men who had been brought to Utah to work on the pig farm. When they found these gentlemen, they did not speak any English. All of their documentation to prove who they were had been taken away from them, and they in fact did not even know that they were in Utah. They were forced to live in the pig sties with the pigs. And as I said, it was one of the largest busts in the FBI history in the beginning of the human trafficking movement. Domestic slavery can occur in hotels, homes, embassies, and anywhere where you could possibly enslave someone in a domestic capacity. The reason that it is a problem in embassies is that embassies have immunity, and an embassy on soil, such as American soil, if they're an embassy of a foreign country, the United States is not legally allowed to go into that embassy to do anything about freeing slaves who might be inside that embassy. So embassies can be of particular concern for people who might be held against their will. Sexual slavery occurs in Utah, predominantly in Salt Lake City in a stretch of motels along State Street between 1300 South and about 3300 South. It also occurs in some motels on North Temple. There is great debate about why these institutions cannot be prosecuted for human trafficking and sexual slavery, and the bottom line is that we cannot find victims who are willing to come forward and testify against the motel owners. And if you cannot find people who are willing to testify, it makes it very, very difficult for prosecutors to have a case. So let's talk about forced commercial sexual activity, and I do use the word forced, and as you can see on the slides, it is reinforced over and over again in red. So forced sexually explicit performances, forced commercial sex work, commercial sexual exploitation and sex work, forced participation in the production of pornography, and forced performance in strip clubs, forced exotic dancing or display. Now, I am not in any way indicating that people cannot make a choice to participate in commercial sex work. I am only talking about forced commercial sex work. We do know that approximately 5% of commercial sex workers, 5% or less, make a choice to be commercial sex workers. That is their primary occupation, and they are not under the control of anyone. They set their own schedules, and basically they run their own businesses. So it's very important that we recognize that there are individuals who do choose to do this work as a profession that is not forced. There are other forms of sex trafficking as well. There is forced marriage, as we have previously discussed, which occurs, but we don't see it on a large scale in Utah. There are mail order bride schemes. There is survival sex, that is sexual acts with an exchange for food, clothing, shelter, or physical protection. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, our first needs are food, clothing, and shelter. And when you are living on the street, you will do anything in order to meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so we call this survival sex in order to put a roof over your head, clothing on your back, and food in your mouth. Other forms of sex trafficking incurred commercial production and distribution of child pornography and recording images, video, or live streaming of sexual content with or without someone's knowledge. In Utah, Utah Code reads, any sexual act with a child under the age of 14 are prohibited by law in all circumstances, regardless of financial exchange. So anyone under the age of 14 who is engaged in a sexual act, whether for money or not for pay, it is 100% illegal in the state of Utah. So who is at risk for trafficking victimization? No one is completely immune. However, there are some individuals who are at a higher risk, and those that live in poverty or are escaping natural disasters and war provide the greatest risk for being trafficked worldwide. There are specific risk factors for child victims. Sexual abuse in childhood can increase a child's vulnerability to commercial sexual exploitation. Children may be conditioned from a very young age to accept inappropriate sexual attention from adults in exchange for emotional or material rewards. That is, if you will do this, I will give you a toy as an example, or I will give you a cookie as an example. Another thing that is a risk factor for child victims is existing prostitution laws continue to treat juvenile victims of commercial sexual exploitation as criminals rather than treating them as victims of sexual assault and trafficking. And there are only 15 states currently that have taken the word prostitute out of their legal code. 35 states still define children as prostitutes, and it's impossible to call a child a prostitute. A child, by definition, cannot be prostituted. They are exploited. And so rather than placing the blame upon the child, we really need to be looking at those that are engaging in these types of behaviors and prosecuting them to the full extent of the law rather than looking at the children as to blame. There are some false perceptions, and those are women and youth who are homeless or have a history of drug use or criminal involvement are seen as contributing to their own victimization, and many times those that are holding them will intentionally get them addicted to drugs so that they can have greater control over them. Another instance that we see is rape and sexual assault are particularly effective at creating vulnerability in communities where premarital and extramarital sex is criminalized. And in this instance, think about the Middle East, where it is illegal to have premarital or extramarital sex. These victims are led to believe that they will be killed or stigmatized if they do not comply with the traffickers' demands. Where can trafficking occur? In illegal and underground markets, in legitimate businesses such as hotels, bars and clubs, nail salons, fake massage parlors, truck stops, strip clubs, almost anywhere. How do traffickers evade detection? Traffickers count on individual and systemic forms of discrimination and oppression that fail to protect those that are the most vulnerable. They prey upon those who are marginalized, disempowered, or stigmatized. So think about those who have been involved in natural disasters or war, or those who are living in absolute poverty. They are the easiest to prey upon. Traffickers may exploit vulnerabilities such as an immigration status, or may create vulnerability by threatening harm to a family or family members, and, as I've stated before, forcing drug use upon those that have been trafficked in order to create dependency on the trafficker for their next fix with drugs. There are institutional barriers to trafficking. So traffickers often maintain control and escape detection by convincing their victims that they will be punished for breaking the law if they talk to law enforcement. This is a really, really effective form of control and coercion. If you go to the police, they're not going to believe you. They will arrest you and throw you in jail, and then I will have to come and get you out. When traffickers use this tactic, it creates fear and mistrust of law enforcement, and the victims will not come forward. So when the victims are treated as criminals, the trafficker is proved right, and this reinforces the position as the only person that a victim can trust is the person who is trafficking them. So why is this happening? As you can see in this slide, I've got piles and piles of money. Trafficking is a very profitable enterprise. Trafficking and sexual slavery are the second most profitable criminal enterprises on the planet. Only the illegal drug trade is currently making more money. Trafficking and slavery have eclipsed all illegal gun and arms sales worldwide in terms of profitability. Unlike drugs or guns, human beings can be sold over and over again, and a slave's only escape is to be rescued, to run, or to die. Trafficking and slavery are slated to become the most profitable criminal enterprises on the planet within 3 years, if not sooner. So, let's talk about some criminal statistics. There are approximately 17,000 murders per year in the United States. That averages 44 per day. Of those 17,000 murders, 70% of the crimes are solved and the perpetrators go to prison. Now let's talk about criminal statistics in slavery. There are approximately 60,000 slaves in the United States per year. Less than 1% of all traffickers in the United States are brought to justice. The value of slavery. So 4,000 years ago, and we're talking around 2000 BCE, slaves were extremely expensive. In today's dollars, a slave would cost $40,000. Slaves were highly valued, and slaves were well treated because they were a very, very expensive commodity to the Greeks and the Romans who owned them. In 1850, a 19-year-old agricultural worker, an African-American slave, was valued at around $1,000. Today, the price for a slave is $90, and if you are a child, the price is actually $30. There are 7.2 billion people worldwide. Of the 7.2 billion people, 6 to 7 million are continuously vulnerable to becoming slaves. So, the realities of trafficking. Trafficking is occurring all across our state, and as you can see from the slides I am pulling up, these are actual stories that have appeared on television, radio, print journalism. So an example of one, Utah Attorney General's Office busts a human trafficking ring. This was reported on Channel 4. The Deseret News, arrests highlight prevalent problem of human trafficking in Utah. Utah massage parlor owner sent to prison for human trafficking. This is another news report. Deseret News again, alleged mastermind in sex trafficking ring now faces 34 felonies. And this gentleman actually ended up committing suicide in prison rather than face his crimes. Thai workers in Utah caught up in human trafficking probe. This is in the Salt Lake Tribune. 8 arrested in Utah for alleged sex trafficking of children. Another article in the Salt Lake Tribune. This is a radio announcement. Multi-agency investigation leads to arrest in human trafficking case. And Riverdale police, this is a Riverdale Post, break up prostitution ring involving minors. I'm a little uncomfortable with the word prostitution and minor. Unfortunately, Utah is one of the states of the 35 that have not taken the word prostitution out of code yet. We are still treating children in Utah as if they were prostitutes. KCSG television, 5 arrested in vice sting operation. Cedar City News, man arrested following human trafficking kidnapping investigation. And finally, what do we need to do here in Utah in order to help trafficking victims? We need a building or a facility for trafficking victims. Currently, victims can be placed in hotels or motels, or they can be placed in the homeless shelter, which is not always a safe environment for them. The YWCA is somewhat hesitant to take victims of trafficking because security needs are so great for that type of a victim. So really and truly, we do not have a specific facility or building for victims of trafficking. We have a need for better education for the public, service providers, and most definitely for legislators. We have a need for more accurate numbers of Utah trafficking victims. Currently, there is only one state in the nation that has ever done a comprehensive study on how many victims they actually have in their state, and that is Georgia. The Georgia legislature basically gave $4 million to 2 universities so that they would be able to conduct a statewide survey on the number of trafficking victims. It was a comprehensive study using graduate students from 2 universities who fanned out across the state to find out exactly how many victims of trafficking they did have. In addition to accurate numbers in Utah, we need a common language to describe trafficking victims. We use words in the state such as victim, survivor, prostitute, commercial sex worker, And there is no common language that we use when we're describing or talking about sex slaves. In Utah, we also have a need for mandatory posting. The Salt Lake International Airport does not post any kind of information currently about how to report if you believe you've seen someone in the airport or seen someone on a plane. There is a 1-800 number that other airports across the country make public. Not only do they use signs in baggage claim areas, but they also put signs in the restrooms as well in order for victims to be able to contact someone and let them know that they have been taken illegally. This slide is in the Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport, and this is actually carved into the wall. It is granite on granite. And this next slide is in the Las Vegas International Airport in the baggage claim area. And on this slide, you will see recognize it, report it, help is available with a 1-888 number, which is a toll-free 24-hour a day, 365 days a year number that is always available to victims of trafficking. So, what currently is working in Utah? We have a federal grant that's administered by the Asian Association of Utah through their TIP, that's Trafficking in Persons, which currently serves all victims, including domestic and foreign-born victims. Prior to 2013, in Utah, we were only allowed to service victims who were foreign-born. We were not allowed to service domestic-born victims of trafficking. And beginning in January of 2014, domestic victims of human trafficking were also included in that federal grant. They can be male or female minors, and it can involve sex or labor trafficking. The services that AAU, Trafficking in Persons, provides are case management and service planning, basic needs, mental health care, interpreter translator services, substance abuse treatment, and that can include drug and alcohol abuse treatment, victim advocacy, English classes, and transportation assistance so that they can go to classes and get any kind of mental or physical health care that they might be in need of. Community partners are also involved in this movement, and they're offering the following services: shelter, medical care, dental care, basic education, job training and employment, legal services, and immigration relief. And immigration relief is extremely important if you are a victim of foreign trafficking, if you were a foreign-born victim of trafficking. So in Utah, we need better legislation for victims of human trafficking and sexual slavery. And better legislation includes mandatory posting in our airport, taking the word child prostitute out of our code, and falling more in line with federal guidelines in regards to prosecuting traffickers. For more information and to report suspected human trafficking, contact Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force. That's UTIP. Their number is 801-200-3443.
Will you just say the whole thing again?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. For more information and to report suspected human trafficking, contact the Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force. That is UTIP. Their number is 801-200-3443. You can also contact the Polaris Project for a World Without Slavery. Their national hotline, which is available 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, is 1-888-373-7888, or their website is www.polarisproject, all one word, POLARISPROJECT.org. Shared Hope International, Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking, their website is www.sharedhope.org. That's shared, all one word, SHARED, hope, HOPE.org. And the United States Department of State, www.state.gov/J/TIP. Why should we care about this? Slavery was abolished in the United States over 150 years ago, and yet it is more pervasive now than at any time when it was completely legal. What does it say about us as a species if we allow this practice to continue? Are we better than this? And finally, a question for you to think about: what do you see happening in the future in regards to this movement? I want to thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My email address is Laurie, Laurie, Hofmann, HOFMANN 2015 @gmail.com. Thank you very much.